I still remember the sound of the glass hitting the floor, sharp, final, like the snap of a bone. It wasn't the glass that broke me though, it was what I saw in the reflection just before it slipped from my hand. My wife, Elise, her head tilted back in laughter, her arm brushing against my brother-in-law Paul's shoulder. Too close. Too familiar. That image burned into me, a splinter under the skin, and I couldn't shake it. It was last Tuesday, at my sister Mara's house, during one of those family dinners we'd all pretended to enjoy for years. I didn't know then what I know now, but the crack had started, and there was no going back. I'd always trusted Elise. 12 years of marriage, 2 kids, a mortgage we'd fought tooth and nail to pay down. She was my anchor. Paul, though, he'd never sat right with me. Mara's husband had a salesman's grin, the kind that made you check your pockets after he left the room. I'd ignored it for her sake. Mara was fragile, always had been, and Paul was her choice, not mine. But that night, something shifted. I caught the way Elise's eyes lingered on him, the way she laughed a little too hard at his stupid jokes. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to plant a seed. The next morning, I couldn't look at her. She was in the kitchen, humming, pouring coffee like nothing had changed. "You're quiet," she said, her voice light, testing. I muttered something about work and left early, the kids still asleep upstairs. I drove aimlessly, the seed growing roots, twisting through me. By noon, I was parked outside Paul's office, some shiny real estate firm downtown. I didn't go in. I just watched. Watched him step out for lunch, his tie loose, his phone pressed to his ear. Watched him smile like he didn't have a care in the world. That's when I knew I needed proof. It took 3 days. 3 days of pretending everything was fine, of kissing Elise goodnight while my stomach churned. I borrowed a friend's car, a beat-up sedan Paul wouldn't recognize, and followed him after work. He didn't go home to Mara. He drove to a motel, the kind with flickering neon signs and curtains that never quite close. I parked across the street, my hands tight on the wheel. And then I saw her. Elise. My Elise, stepping out of our minivan, glancing around like she was afraid of being seen. She wasn't afraid enough. They disappeared into room 14, and I sat there, frozen, the world tilting under me. I don't know how long I stayed. An hour, maybe 2. When they came out, her hair was mussed, his shirt untucked. They didn't kiss goodbye, too careful for that, but the way she touched his arm said everything. I drove home shaking, rage and shame fighting for space in my chest. Elise was already there when I walked in, stirring pasta on the stove, asking how my day was. I lied. I said it was fine. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed felt like a stranger's. I kept seeing them, her hand on his arm, his smirk, the motel door closing. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed someone else to know, someone who'd feel this as deep as I did. Mara. My sister. Paul's wife. She deserved the truth, and I deserved an ally. I called her at dawn, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "We need to talk," I said. "It's about Paul." She didn't hesitate. "Come over. Now." Mara's house smelled like lavender and regret when I walked in. She was waiting in the living room, her hands twisting a dish towel like it was a lifeline. Her eyes, pale blue, just like Mom's, met mine, and I saw the question there before she even spoke. "What's wrong with Paul?" she asked, her voice thin, already braced for something ugly. I hadn't planned what to say, not really. The drive over had been a blur of red lights and half-formed curses, but standing there, I knew I couldn't soften it. She had to feel what I felt. "Sit down," I said. She didn't. She crossed her arms, the towel dangling, and I took a breath. "It's Elise. And Paul. They're together." The words tasted like ash, bitter and dry. Mara's face didn't change at first, like she hadn't heard me. Then her mouth twitched, a small, sharp movement, and she whispered, "What do you mean, together?" I wanted to spare her the details, the motel, the mussed hair, the way they'd moved like they'd done it before, but I couldn't. She needed to see it, every jagged edge. I told her everything. The dinner, the suspicion, the stakeout. Room 14. Her breathing got shallow, her fingers digging into her arms, but she didn't cry. Not yet. How long? She asked, and I shook my head. I don't know. Long enough. She turned away, staring at the framed photo on the mantel, her and Paul on their wedding day, all smiles and promises. I knew something was off, she said, so quiet I almost missed it. He's been late. Distant. I thought it was work. It's not work, I said, sharper than I meant. It's my wife. The silence after that was heavy, like the air before a storm. Mara finally looked at me, her eyes hard now, not fragile anymore. What do we do? She asked. That's when it hit me. I hadn't just come to tell her. I'd come to plan. To strike back. They'd gutted us both, and I wasn't going to let it stand. We make them pay, I said, my voice low, steady. Not loud. Not messy. Quiet. Smart. We hit them where it hurts, and they don't see it coming. Mara's brow furrowed, but she didn't flinch. How? She asked. I leaned forward, the idea taking shape as I spoke. Paul's got his business, those shady deals he brags about. Elise has her secrets, too. We dig. We find what they're hiding. Then we use it. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. You mean ruin them? More than that, I said. We take everything they care about, his money, her reputation, and we burn it down. Together. Mara didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, staring out at the street where Paul's car wasn't parked. When she turned back, her jaw was set. I'm in, she said. But we need proof. Real proof. Something they can't talk their way out of. She was right. What I'd seen wasn't enough. Not for a fight like this. We needed evidence, something concrete to hold over them. I'll get it, I said. Tonight. Mara nodded, and for the first time since I'd walked in, I felt something like hope. Not peace, not yet, but a purpose. We were in this together now, and they wouldn't know what hit them. I left Mara's house with a fire in my gut, the kind that doesn't warm you, it consumes. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky a bruised purple, and I knew I had to move fast. Elise would be home soon, playing the dutiful wife, and Paul would be wherever he went when he wasn't with Mara. I needed something solid, texts, emails, a paper trail, before they could cover their tracks. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, but my mind was clear. This wasn't about feeling anymore. It was about doing. I started with Elise. Our house was empty when I got there, the kids at a sleepover, thank God. Her laptop sat on the kitchen counter, lid half open like she'd left in a hurry. She'd always been careless with passwords. Our anniversary, 0612, the same for everything. I typed it in, and the screen blinked to life. Emails first. Nothing obvious, just work stuff and spam. Then I checked her messages. The app synced to her phone. My heart stopped when I saw Paul's name, buried under a thread labeled, Work Friend. Subtle but not subtle enough. The messages weren't long, short bursts, careful, but damning. Missed you today, he'd written last week. Can't wait for Thursday, she'd replied. Thursday. The motel. There were more, stretching back months, each one a knife twist. No pictures, no confessions, but the tone was enough. Too intimate, too secret. I took screenshots with my phone, every single one, my hands steady now. This was fuel. This was power. Next. Paul. I couldn't get into his office, not yet, but I knew his car. He parked it at the firm every day, a sleek black thing he loved more than Mara, probably more than Elise. If he was sloppy with Elise, he might be sloppy there, too. I drove back downtown, the streets quiet now, and found it in the lot, unlocked. Typical Paul. Arrogant, careless. I slipped inside, the leather creaking under me, and rummaged through the glove box. Receipts, gum, a pen. Then, under the passenger seat, a burner phone. Cheap, prepaid, the kind you buy when you've got something to hide. It powered on, no lock. The call log was short. 2 numbers, over and over. One was Elisa's. The other I didn't recognize, but I wrote it down. Texts were sparse, just times and places. Motel, 7, one said. Home late, another. Enough to bury him. I pocketed the phone, evidence Mara and I could use, and got out, my pulse hammering. I'd crossed a line, but it felt right. They'd crossed worse. Back home, Elise was in the shower when I walked in. "You're late," she called, her voice muffled by water. "Traffic," I lied, setting the burner phone on my nightstand, hidden under a book. I'd show Mara tomorrow. We'd plan the next move. But as I lay in bed, listening to the water stop, I realized something. They weren't the only ones hiding things now. I was too. And I was better at it than they'd ever be. Mara's kitchen felt different the next morning, like a war room, not a home. She'd made coffee, but it sat untouched, steam curling up between us as I laid out what I'd found. The screenshots from Elisa's laptop glowed on my phone screen, and the burner phone sat on the table, its scratched plastic case catching the light. Mara stared at it all, her face pale but her eyes sharp, like she was memorizing every detail. "This is it," she said finally, her voice tight. "This is enough to start." "Start what?" I asked, though I already knew. She leaned forward, her fingers tapping the table. "We don't just confront them. That's too easy. They'll lie, twist it, make us the bad guys. We need leverage, something they can't dodge." I nodded, the burner phone's weight in my mind even as it sat there. "The other number," I said. "It's not Elisa's. Could be someone else he's playing." Mara's lips pressed thin. "Or a client. Someone he's screwing over in business, too." Paul's real estate gig wasn't clean. I'd always suspected it. He bragged about creative financing and off-the-books deals when he'd had too much whiskey. If we could tie that number to something dirty, we'd have him by the throat. "I'll call it," I said, reaching for the burner. Mara grabbed my wrist. "Not yet. We don't know who's on the other end. If it's big, we need to be ready." She was right. We couldn't tip our hand. Instead, we mapped it out. Step 1. Dig deeper. I'd tail Paul again, see where he went, who he met. Mara would watch Elise. Casual, subtle, like a sister-in-law should. Step 2. The number. We'd trace it, figure out its owner, maybe hire someone discreet if we had to. Step 3. The hit. "His business," Mara said, her voice cold. "He lives for it. We find the dirt, expose it, clients, cops, whatever works." I added, "Elisa's reputation. She's all about her perfect mom image. We leak this, she's done." We didn't say divorce. Not yet. This wasn't about leaving. It was about destroying. Mara's eyes met mine, and I saw my own anger mirrored there. "They think we're weak," she said. "They're wrong." I almost smiled. Dead wrong. We split the evidence. I kept the phone, she took the screenshots on a USB drive. "Tomorrow," I said, "we start." That night, Elise was quiet at dinner, picking at her food. "You okay?" she asked, her tone too soft, like she was fishing. I forced a shrug. "Tired." She didn't push, but her eyes lingered, and I wondered if she sensed something. Let her wonder. I slept on the couch, claiming a bad back, and dreamed of Paul's car burning, Elise screaming his name. When I woke, the sun was up, and I was ready. Mara texted me one word: go. I didn't waste time that morning. Elise was out the door early, some PDA thing, she said, and I was in my friend's sedan by 8 a.m., parked 2 blocks from Paul's office. The burner phone sat in my pocket, a silent promise. He rolled in at 9:15, late as usual, his tie crooked like he'd slept in it. I waited, engine off, until he left again at noon. Not for lunch this time. He drove east, past the diner he liked, toward the industrial edge of town. I followed, keeping distance, my knuckles white on the wheel. He stopped at a warehouse, gray and unmarked, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking. I parked behind a rusted dumpster, watching as he got out and met a guy. Tall, shaved head, suit too nice for this dump. They talked fast, hands moving, then Paul handed over an envelope. Cash, maybe. The guy gave him a folder in return. Drugs? Papers? I couldn't tell, but it wasn't legit. Paul's grin was too smug. I snapped photos with my phone, blurry but usable. When he drove off, I stayed on him. He didn't go back to the office. He hit a bar instead, some hole in the wall with a flickering sign. I waited 10 minutes, then went in. Dim lights, stale beer smell. Paul was in a booth, alone, nursing a whiskey and flipping through that folder. I slid into the bar stool farthest from him, cap low, and ordered a soda I didn't drink. He didn't notice me. Too busy scribbling notes, muttering to himself. I caught fragments. Deal set. She won't know. Elise? Mara? Someone else? I needed that folder. I texted Mara. He's at Rusty's. Sketchy meet earlier. Papers involved. She replied fast. Stay on him. I've got Elise. I didn't ask what she meant. Trust was all we had now. Paul left after an hour, folder tucked under his arm. I followed him home this time, to Mara's place. She wasn't there, probably tailing Elise like she'd said. He went inside, lights on, curtains open. I parked across the street, watching. He paced, phone to his ear, then disappeared upstairs. The folder stayed on the table. I could have broken in. Door was probably unlocked. Paul's arrogance again. But I didn't. Too risky with neighbors around. Instead, I called the burner's mystery number from my own phone, voice changer app on, heart pounding. It rang twice. A man answered, gruff, impatient. Yeah. I deepened my voice. Paul sent me. About the deal. Silence then. Who the hell are you? I hung up, adrenaline spiking. Not enough, but it was a start. Whoever he was, he knew Paul, and he wasn't happy. Mara called as I drove home. Elise met him, she said, breathless. Coffee shop. I got pictures. I gripped the phone. Good. I've got something, too. Meet me tomorrow. She agreed, and I hung up, mind racing. The warehouse, the folder, the voice, they were pieces, and we were close. Elise was asleep when I got in, her breathing soft, deceptive. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Not with the game shifting under us. Mara looked like she hadn't slept when I met her at the park the next day. Her hands shook as she handed me her phone, the screen glowing with photos, Elise and Paul at a coffee shop, heads bent close, her fingers brushing his. Yesterday, she said, her voice raw. I followed her after she left the house. They didn't see me. The pictures were grainy, taken from across the street, but they were gold. Intimate. Undeniable. I showed her mine, the warehouse, Paul with the bald guy, the folder exchange. Her eyes narrowed. What's he into? I don't know yet, I said, pulling out the burner phone. But this number, he's scared of whoever's on it. I called. Guy sounded pissed. Mara took the phone, turned it over in her hands like it might bite. We need more, she said. The folder. If it's dirty, we've got him. I nodded. He left it at your place last night. Table, downstairs. Her jaw tightened. I'll get it. We split up again. Mara to her house, me back to the warehouse. I needed context, a thread to pull. The place was quiet when I got there, no cars, no bald guy. Just peeling paint and a padlocked door. I circled it, found a window cracked open, too high to climb but low enough to hear through. Nothing inside but echoes. Then I saw it. Tire tracks, fresh, leading to a side lot. A scrap of paper caught in the gravel. Lot 17, 50K. Deal numbers? I pocketed it, mind spinning. Mara texted an hour later. Got it. Meet me now. I drove to her friend's place, a tiny apartment she'd borrowed to keep this off Paul's radar. She had the folder spread out on the table, papers fanned like a deck of cards. Land deals, she said, pointing. Offshore accounts. Names I don't know. I scanned them. Contracts, signatures, figures in the millions. Paul's name was everywhere, but so was another. Victor Crane. The bald guy. I wondered aloud. Mara shrugged. Maybe. But look. Dates. Some match their meetings. It clicked. Paul wasn't just cheating. He was laundering, hiding cash through fake sales. Elise might not know the details, but she was in deep enough to benefit. This could ruin him, I said, voice low. Prison, even. Mara's eyes glinted. Good. Her too. We sorted the papers. Enough for a lawyer, maybe the cops. But I wanted more. I wanted them to feel it first. We confront them, I said. Not yet, but soon. With this, and more. That night, Elise asked why I was so quiet. Work, I muttered, avoiding her eyes. She didn't push, but I caught her texting later, quick and secretive. Paul, probably. I checked the burner after she slept. New message, Crane's antsy. Speed it up. I grinned, dark and cold. Crane, whoever he was our ace. We'd push him, break Paul, and watch Elise fall with him. Mara and I were ready. They weren't. The folder was our weapon, but it wasn't enough to swing yet. Mara and I sat in that cramped apartment, papers scattered, coffee cold, plotting the next strike. Crane's the key, I said, tapping the burner phone. He's twitchy. If we push him, Paul panics. Mara nodded, her fingers tracing a signature. Victor Crane, bold and looped. How? She asked. I leaned back, the idea forming. We bluff. Make Crane think Paul's screwing him. He'll move, and we'll catch it. We drafted a text from the burner. Crane, Paul's talking. Wants out. Check your accounts. Short, vague, enough to spark paranoia. Mara watched me type, her breath shallow. What if he calls? She asked. He won't, I said. Not right away. He'll check first. I hit send, and we waited, the silence thick. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed. Crane, where's he at? I grinned. See? Hooked. I replied, home. Watch him. Let Crane do the dirty work. That night, I tailed Paul again. He left the office late, jittery, checking his mirrors. Crane must have rattled him. He didn't go to Mara's, he hit the motel. Elise's car was already there, parked crooked. I stayed back, watching. They argued outside room 14, voices low but sharp. Paul gestured wild. Elise shook her head. Trouble in paradise. I snapped photos, sent them to Mara with one word, now. She texted back. He called me. Sounded off. I'm home. Perfect. Paul was cracking, and Elise was caught. I drove to Mara's, found her in the kitchen, the folder hidden in a drawer. He's scared, she said, eyes bright. Asked if I'd seen his phone. I played dumb. I pulled out the burner, showed her Crane's reply. He's circling, I said. We've got him. Mara's smile was thin, dangerous. What's next? We set the trap, I said. Leak a piece, something small, to Crane. Make him think Paul's double-crossing. Then we watch him burn. We picked a page from the folder, a transfer, $200,000, tied to a shell company. Mara knew a guy, ex-cop turned PI, discreet. We'd send it anonymous. Let Crane connect the dots. Elise? Mara asked. I clenched my jaw. She's collateral. When Paul falls, she's exposed. I went home, the plan buzzing in me. Elise was on the couch, wine glass in hand, eyes red. Rough day? I asked, casual. She nodded, vague. Just tired. Lies. I didn't care. The burner buzzed later. Crane again, he's dead if this is real. I didn't reply. Let him stew. By morning, Mara's PI had the leak sent, and Paul called me, voice tight. You seen Mara? She's acting weird. I lied smooth. She's fine. You okay? He hung up fast. The net was tightening, and they didn't even know who held the strings. Paul was unraveling by the next afternoon. I could hear it in his voice when he called Mara, demanding she meet him. She played it cool, told me later how he'd rambled about problems at work, his tone frantic. Crane must have gotten the leak. I pictured him, bald, furious, checking accounts, finding holes Paul couldn't explain. Good. Let him sweat. I stayed home, watching Elise instead. She was jittery, phone glued to her hand, texting non-stop. Paul, no doubt. I didn't check her messages this time. Didn't need to. The trap was set. Mara met me at dusk, her car parked behind a gas station, out of sight. She had news. Paul's meeting someone tonight, she said, breathless. Overheard him on the phone. Warehouse, 10 p.m. sounded desperate. I nodded, the burner heavy in my pocket. Crane, I guessed. He's calling in the debt. Mara's eyes gleamed. We go. Record it. End him. I agreed. Audio, video, irrefutable proof to bury Paul and drag Elise down with him. We took her car, less recognizable. The warehouse loomed dark when we got there, 9:45, no lights but a faint glow inside. We parked a block away, crept closer on foot, my phone's camera ready. Paul's black sedan rolled up at 10 sharp, tires crunching gravel. He got out, pacing, hands in his hair. Then another car, sleek, silver, Crane. The bald guy stepped out, bigger than I'd remembered, his face a mask of rage. You screwed me, he barked, voice carrying. Paul raised his hands. It's a mix-up, Vic. Mix-up. Crane shoved him hard. $500,000 gone. Paul stumbled, babbling about banks, delays. I hit record, zoomed in. Mara whispered, keep going. Crane grabbed Paul's collar, snarled something about fixing it tonight. Then, a twist. Your girl knows too much, Crane said. Paul froze. She don't lie. Crane roared. Elise. He meant Elise. My gut twisted, but I kept filming. They were both in it, deeper than I'd thought. Headlights cut the dark. Another car. Elise's minivan. She stepped out, panicked, calling Paul's name. Crane spun, glared. What's she doing here? Paul stammered. I didn't. Elise saw Crane, stopped cold. You said it was safe, she hissed at Paul. He shook his head, wild-eyed. Crane laughed. Bitter. Safe? You're both dead. I caught it all. Every word, every flinch. Mara gripped my arm. This is it, she breathed. We've got them. Crane stormed off, tires screeching. Paul and Elise argued, frantic, then split, him to his car, her to hers. We stayed hidden, hearts pounding. Back at Mara's friend's place, we played the footage. Clear, devastating. Paul's crimes, Elise's complicity, laid bare. What now? Mara asked, voice steady. I stared at the screen, their faces frozen mid-lie. We light the fuse, I said. Crane's already lit his. The footage was a bomb, and we held the detonator. Mara and I watched it again that night, the grainy video looping on her laptop. Paul's pleas, Crane's threats, Elise's panic. Every frame tightened the noose. We don't go to the cops, I said, voice low. Not yet. We use this first. Mara nodded, her face hard. They need to feel it, before it's over. We agreed. Confrontation, calculated, with evidence they couldn't deny. But first, we'd let Crane's chaos do its work. By morning, Paul was a ghost. Mara said he hadn't come home, his phone off. Elise was worse, pale, jumpy, claiming a sick day from work. I played along, asked if she needed anything. Just space, she snapped, avoiding my eyes. Space. She'd had plenty with Paul. I texted Mara, they're rattled. Tonight. She replied, my place. 8. The plan was simple. Lure them there, show the video, watch them break. Then decide what hit hardest: public shame or legal ruin. I called Paul from the burner, voice masked. "Crane's coming for you," I said. "Mara's. 8 p.m. bring Elise. Fix this." He cursed, demanded who I was. I hung up. He'd show, he had no choice. At 7, I drove to Mara's, the footage on a USB in my pocket. She'd set the scene, lights low, laptop ready, a bottle of wine unopened. "For show," she said, grim. We waited, silent, the air thick with what was coming. Paul arrived first, 7:55, banging the door open. "Mara, what the hell?" He stopped, seeing me. "You." Elise followed, hesitant, her eyes darting. "What's this?" she asked, voice small. I locked the door behind them. "Sit," I said, calm, cold. They did, Paul sweating, Elise clutching her purse. Mara hit play. The warehouse filled the screen. Crane's rage, their guilt. Paul's face drained. Elise gasped. "How?" "Shut up," Mara snapped. "We know everything. The affair. The money. Crane." Paul tried to stand. "This is fake." I shoved him down. "It's real. And it's over." Elise sobbed. "I didn't mean." I cut her off. "You did. Both of you." Mara leaned in, voice like ice. "You took our lives. Now we take yours." Paul lunged for the laptop. I grabbed his arm, twisted. "Sit. Watch." The room went still, the video's audio looping their doom. "What do you want?" Paul rasped. I smiled. Dark. "Everything. Your business, gone. Her perfect life, ashes. Crane's already started. We finish it." Elise begged. "Please, the kids. You should have thought of them," I said. Mara tossed the folder on the table. Proof of Paul's deals. "This goes public tomorrow. Unless you disappear. Tonight."